Hello and welcome.
Oh, I guess we're rolling. Okay, welcome back to the show. We have Christa Couture with us today. Thank you so much for coming on to the program. Usually with the other guests that we've had, it's been at least 2 years, 18 months since the last time we saw anyone because due to the pandemic.
Right.
But with you, we just saw you last year. You were here.
I saw you during the pandemic.
That's right.
You're
Correct.
like one of the 3 people I saw
That's
during
right.
the pandemic.
So it's very rare that we have guests here that we've seen you within the last year.
Yeah.
And that was just before, I guess, you were getting ready to launch your book.
Yeah, my book was launched and I was here recording the narration for a short film we were making.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the book title, for those that aren't familiar?
It's called How to Lose Everything.
Great. And that came out in 2020.
Came out in
Right.
September 2020. The paperback just came out this September 2021.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's out on paperback.
It's out on paperback.
Is it usually come out like a year later? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how the literary sort of process works.
I'm also
for,
like just learning the literary process.
Okay.
There was sort of like, it'll come out when we sell out of hardcovers, what I was told. So I guess that took about that long.
Oh, I see. Great.
Whether that's short or fast, I don't know. Maybe they didn't have a lot of hardcovers. It's kind of one of those things where you say, we sold out. And you're like, but did you only have 10? Hard to say. They had more than 10. But yeah, I guess about a year seems kind of average. It was maybe going to be a bit longer. There's all sorts of staggered things that came out in the States halfway through that, like in March. The literary world is a whole new thing.
It is. And it's now available worldwide as well. Okay.
Yes.
And on different formats, like I don't know what the formats are. The Kindle, I guess. Does that still exist? I don't know.
Ebook? Yeah, it's
E-books?
on ebook.
Okay, right.
And the audiobook is supposed to be out any second now. Maybe it's out right now.
Okay.
I recorded that over the last winter, and then there were some delays. And so, it's been like little staggered releases of the various versions. I'm really excited to share the audiobook because, as an audio person, it was like meaningful to read it and to share it that way.
Right.
But it pretty much out in the world everywhere.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So that's a sort of another, I guess, title you're adding because you're performing artist, recording artist, broadcaster, writer as well. And what else are you going to add to the list of titles?
Well, filmmaker now because I've made
right.
this. I've made
That's
this
right.
short film, which is currently doing the rounds at festivals. Yeah, the writer one is one I'm like still not totally used to.
No, you okay?
I was just at this at a literary festival last week in Vancouver. I got to go in person. And you go to the conferences, you get the name tag, right? Like
Sure.
we all have the lanyard and the name tag.
Right. Yeah.
And so I had my name and it said author, and I was like, ooh, author. Okay, yes, I'm at a literary festival with the book I wrote. Author, right? But I'm still wrapping my head around it. Although I loved the experience, I loved writing the book. I think I might write another one. I mean, it's a lot of work. There's a lot of words that you have to write down.
I was about to ask you that because every time, sometimes I'll get the idea, hey, I'm going to write a short story or a book, but I can't get past sort of the first page. And that's kind of where I get, writer's block or bogged down with ideas. Was that sort of easy for you to write the book? Because this is kind of a memoir from your own experience. So you're not necessarily like coming up with different character names or a plot line or even a subplot. These things actually happen to you.
Yeah, I was pulling from memory. I mean, I would say the hard part for me was writing the proposal. I started with a proposal and an outline so that I could hopefully sell the book. This is another thing I learned in the literary world. Like if you write fiction, you have to have the whole manuscript before you show it to a publisher.
I see.
But for some reason with nonfiction, you can just show them a proposal and they'll buy it.
Okay.
And maybe because they're like, yeah, you already know the ending or whatever.
Right.
And so the proposal I found was kind of a bit of pulling teeth because there's sort of the pitch of it's this, this book meets this book. It's going to explore, grief and resilience, and then writing kind of a description of what I thought each chapter would be. That was kind of the hard part of deciding what to put in the book. Mm-hmm. But then having that proposal really helped me once I sat down to write it, because I was like, oh, right, I already said this chapter would be about this. Great.
Right.
It's at least a starting point. It gave me something to follow. And we made some changes later.
Okay.
But yeah, it's kind of, I saw this woman speak. Oh, her name will come to me. She's a mortician. She's published a couple books. But someone asked her about the process of writing, and she said her advice was, don't write a book unless you absolutely have to. Because it's so much work. But I thought of that a few times because I'd feel sort of, like you described, a writer's block or a bit daunted with where am I going with this. And I'd remember that advice, and each time I actually felt, but I have to. I really want to do this. And that would help me get back to, pushing through that moment, getting it done, getting the words on the page.
Now, I've seen some writers' work, and they have like a bunch of like Post-it notes or little cards with kind of outlines and their ideas, and they have it on this, this giant, billboard. Kind of looks like a CSI or a detective show where they're trying to map together the murder. I've seen people do that way, and then I've seen some writers, they use like software to keep track of all their ideas. I guess it's kind of like the board, but it's technology based.
Yeah.
What was your process? You using the sticky notes, or you're using your laptop?
I didn't do the sticky notes, in part because I was writing this book when my daughter was 1 year old, and I was like sneaking in like an hour in a coffee shop, an hour in the library.
Right. So you were one of those writers in the coffee shop.
Yes.
Working on your novel.
Working on my own. What a cliche, right? But I did for a while try the app version. There's one called Scrivener, which is sort of the equivalent of sticky notes, and you can visually move things around.
Right.
Ultimately, I was pretty old school with just like Word docs and folders. Like I kind of, you don't have to get the app and do all the things. I just had kind of ongoing different Word docs with different dates,
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. And is there like a word limit to a book? To classify it as a book versus, I actually don't know what the other classifications are.
Something smaller
versus
than
something
a book.
like a short story or an anthology.
Right, or like novella, which is like a tiny novel.
Right, that's right.
Good question. I had to sort of look at existing memoirs and books that I loved, and I was like, what kind of length do I think this is going to be? And I was like, about this thick. And then I would look at what those books were and kind of guess the word count. My book is around 55,000 words, which is not super long.
Right.
Like the audiobook is less than 5 hours to read or listen to. Whereas I think kind of, the thicker books, you're getting into like 80, 90,000 words.
Okay. Right.
For when you get to your novel.
Sure. Okay. That's right.
Keep that in mind.
I will. I'll have to keep an eye on the word, the number count, word count at the bottom. That's right.
Yeah, there is always a word count. Like, it's a big moment when you see, 10,000 words. Okay, 20,000 words. Like, the word count is like daunting, but also can really help you mark those moments of accomplishment.
Excellent. And then you must have worked with an editor who went through everything, not just for spelling and grammatical errors, but do they offer any advice or changes how to word something better, or so it's less clunky?
Yeah, there was. That's the part of the process I loved, because it was like rearranging a puzzle and making it an even better picture.
Right.
So the first step was working with an editor. I worked with a woman named Barbara Pulling, who is non-Indigenous, but had worked with a number of Indigenous authors. She's worked with the Richards, as I call them, Wagamese and Van Camp.
Right.
So it was a real honor to work with her. And she's old school. She like mailed me the printout with her bit of her spilled tea and her pencil markings and arrows and all kinds of things. But it was sort of beautiful because she's based in Vancouver. I'm here in Toronto, and so I got to at least have this manuscript that she'd held in her hands and kind of turn each page. And so she made really strong suggestions around moving some things so that dots connected a little more smoothly, or pointing out like, you go from here to here, but I think we need to know what happens in between.
Right.
So that we care when this thing happens. She just had a very good sense of the big picture. And then after that, it goes to copy editing and proof editing, and that's where they get very detailed, nitty gritty about verbs and parallelisms and stuff.
Right. And I know this, again, I'm only living or seeing sort of other writers how they do the process. Some was explaining there's even like kind of it's not a fact check, but just to make sure the dates and times are correct. Versus like, you couldn't have been here because that was you were doing this, just to make sure there's what's the word I'm looking for? Like, I guess continuity or
yeah.
right? So
And the editor will do a bit of that.
I see.
And then the copy editor the copy editors are, it's a wonderful job if you like details. And if you're someone who watches movies and you're like, hey, you were wearing a red sock 2 hours ago.
Right.
Like they notice all those things.
That's right.
And they will Google names and dates if you're mentioning anything outside. I mentioned in my book an oncologist I had when I was a kid. So in my book, each chapter focuses on a different loss that I've experienced, and I sometimes introduce it with my grief bio, which is cancer, amputation, death, divorce, and then more cancer. There's a few other little losses.
Right.
But so I had bone cancer when I was a kid, and in that chapter, in the bone cancer chapter, I mentioned this oncologist I had who was really kind and really made a difference to me. And I called him, I think, Dr. Gundy. Anyway, she Googled him and it turns out it's Dr. Grundy or vice versa.
Oh, okay.
But like, even though you'd think, oh, Christa knows the name of her doctor, she was still looking up like names of people that I mentioned to just like fact check all the little things. So, which is a huge help. We all need that help.
Yeah, absolutely.
When we're telling our stories from 30 years ago. Exactly.
Because you always tend to remember it different. And that's why I was reading articles on like eyewitnesses in court cases. Their testimony is not always reliable because they're remembering it with their own sort of cognitive process. They may have seen events differently.
Yeah.
It may not be in reality as well. So it's interesting.
It's interesting. I think there's something powerful about that. I remember a story of someone who was writing about their childhood and their childhood home. And, you know, they said, oh, there was blue on the walls and hardwood floors. And they've written this piece. And then they actually went back to that house and it was like, oh, there wasn't hardwood floors and there weren't blue walls. They had completely misremembered it. And when I was learning about memoir, there's sort of this, you know, when you revisit memories, it might not be what you remember. So do you write how you remember it, or do you write what then you kind of prove to be right or wrong? Like, but I think memory is powerful, and you know, maybe there's reasons that we shaped it in that way. Yeah,
because I always sort of wonder how someone would remember something. Is that because something happened that made that a pleasant memory, and then you associate that color or that object that you thought was in the kitchen that wasn't even there?
Yeah,
now becomes a part of your life and becomes a part of your story. But like you said, do you tell the authentic way it happened, or sort of the the embellished sort of way of the story? And sometimes embellishing the story is kind of, I think, further sells the point. It kind of sells the story maybe to more of a sort of a universal audience that's trying to tap into what you're writing about as well.
Yeah, and with this book, like it is my story, and they are true stories.
Right.
And at the same time, I crafted a book out of it. And so what I chose to include and not include, who I put in there, who I quoted, it's still shaping it from a certain perspective. And you can even, make those different choices to sort of paint someone in a different light, or what you focus on is going to tell a certain story. But so it's like, it's not that I'm writing something false, but I'm shaping a version through all of those choices. Yeah.
Right. And the book's had lots of great feedback from people as well.
Yeah, it has. I mean, because the book came out in September 2020, I was doing, literary festivals, but online. I wasn't getting to talk to people after a reading, all the things, after a show, right? When people come up to you, like as a performer, we love that part, right?
Of course.
And so this experience at the Vancouver Literary Festival last week was the first time where I got to like sit at that table and people came up to me and told me their stories and told me about, losses that they experienced. I mean, even though my book, talks about having cancer and bone cancer and going through divorce, because the two deaths in the book, I have two sons that died, and they're kind of it's called How to Lose Everything. Like my kids they're really the everything. And even though there's only a couple chapters about them, you really sort of feel that loss is present throughout. Because I wrote it now, like me now at this point in my life, that loss is always present. So the most common feedback I get is from other bereaved parents who've lost children, or just people who are grieving. Maybe it's a sibling or a friend, or so there's a lot of people who come up to me and tell me about their loss, which feels so generous, and like people will say, oh, I feel less alone, or I feel, they connect with my book and they feel seen or heard, but I also then get to feel seen and heard.
Right.
Right. Which is like the sort of selfish drive of like, I also want to feel less alone with this stuff. And so that feedback for me is the most meaningful, when people share some part of their life in return,
right.
And then the feedback like about the book, or if people don't personally connect to it, like what the writing meant to them is meaningful too, but really it's the personal connections that I love.
And there's also a musical component attached to the book as well.
Yeah,
there's a collection of songs.
Yeah, so throughout the book I include lyrics to some of the songs I've written over the years, because partly, I've been telling these stories in songs the whole time, which is a very different format. 55,000 words in a book, or like 3 minutes with a rhyming chorus.
Right. Sure.
So it's more in depth in the book, of course. But there's some times where I felt like I think I might have said this better in a song than I'm trying to say it right now in the book. So I would include the lyrics as just an additional bit of detail or color about a certain experience, and then. So that people could hear them, I put together, a collection. It's on Bandcamp of those songs that are kind of from 5 different albums or whatever, as that are mentioned in the book.
Okay, great. Because sometimes using chords and melody that further kind of helps convey the emotion or the mood of the story that you're trying to tell as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And so those songs were all recorded at different times, or and it's more like a collection of...
Yeah, it's a collection. They're all songs that were already released. I just kind of put them in one place. I think there's a Spotify playlist too, so that if people come to my book and they've never heard my music, they know nothing about it, at least this like connects to the stories they've read, and they'll exactly hear that context, that musical, context that tells them even more.
Great. And I was listening to the record you have the Jim Bryson. I listened to that recently, and that's fantastic.
Thank you.
It sounds amazing. I love the songs. I love the texture and the space, everything that Jim did. And how did that come to be? And how did you get to work with Jim Bryson?
How did I get to work with Jim Bryson? I feel like he's going to hate me for saying this. Sorry, Jim. We nicknamed him Indian Jim. He is not Indigenous, but he's worked with so many niches. Okay. Like he made an album with Terry Williamson. I think that's probably the first time I heard about him producing. Like I knew of his music. I remember I started following him on Twitter when he made an album with the Weaker Thans. Right. I think being from Vancouver, you don't always hear about the artists who are in Ontario, So I knew the Weaker Thans because they're in the middle. I sort of knew Manitoba artists. And then I saw that they'd made this album with Jim Bryson. And so I just was kind of aware of him. And then, Tara made an album with him. Leanne Simpson has done some stuff with him.
I think did Liv Wade work with him as well? That's
Liv Wade,
right,
exactly.
Right.
So I was like, okay, we like this guy.
Yeah.
And I had the opportunity to record one song. I was commissioned to make one song for the series Amplify that was on APTN that a bunch of artists made songs for. And so I was like, I'm going to try Jim out. And so he came to Toronto. We did one song together. And I really liked working with him. He's really fun. He's a really good hang. And at this point in my life, I'm like, yes, you need to be skilled. Also need to be a really good hang.
Sure, exactly.
Skill is not the only thing we're going on anymore. And so, then I did a grant application, got some funding to record a few more things, and was delighted to work with him. And so that EP is called Safe Harbour, and it's my first totally piano-based project. In the past,
I was going to ask you about that, because that's right. The instrumentation was different. Piano. I didn't realize you had done all the piano.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And so, on my first couple albums, very acoustic guitar heavy, and then I started to have like a couple piano songs, and then I think my second last album was like half piano, half guitar. Okay. So this was all piano, which I'd always wanted to do. And, sort of chronologically, the songs on Safe Harbour come after the events in the book, even though I think Safe Harbour came out first. But it's like the songs on that album are more about sort of being okay, like finally sort of being in a place where I feel like I can relax and rest and hope. And so I released it in the same year as How to Lose Everything, because I sort of wanted to be like, here's a lot of sad stories.
Right.
I am okay.
Okay, that's right. Sure, yeah.
Some time has passed. Don't worry about me. Yeah.
And do you find that your writing changes from writing on guitar versus piano? Because on a piano, everything's sort of linear. You can see, where you're kind of going, whereas on guitar, sometimes I'll play around with a capo or, I'll come up with some sort of riff. But in piano, I find I'm more methodical about it because to me, it brings me back more to classical training. And I find myself writing more like that.
Oh, interesting.
What about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, piano was my first instrument, right? So common. It's very different. I feel like with the piano, I sort of love how you can just like hit a piano.
Sure.
I don't mean in a aggressive way, like in a way you just get to like bang on a piano, and maybe you can sort of bang on a guitar. I've never had quite the same catharsis with the piano.
Oh, you haven't seen me play guitar.
I guess I'm being like a folk artist. I'm always like blunk, blunk, blunk. Maybe another genre.
Sure.
Yeah, I think with the guitar, I tend to be more folky, singer-songwritery.
Right.
And with the piano, I tend to it draws not on when I was taking like classical, but more when I was in musical theater. And
Right.
So I get a bit more sort of like cabaret kind of feeling with a piano. I'd write more waltzes on a piano.
I see. Okay.
And so the styles are very different. And I feel like on a guitar, because I love, folk songs and sort of, a good pop song, I'll sort of stick to format a bit, the formats that we know work.
Sure.
And with piano, I'll feel like I try to play with things a little bit more. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Do you love both?
Yeah, I lately I've been starting to write more on piano.
You have?
Yeah, I don't know why. I just got bored of playing the guitar. And
After all these years.
I own too many guitars too, so I don't own enough pianos yet. So. Yeah, but I don't know. Something about it. Like you're right. I don't know. I can't, put my finger on what that is. But I think again, because you can see where everything is, all the notes.
Yeah.
And then you kind of know where you're going.
Even that visual, physical part. Like I feel like when I'm holding a guitar, it's sort of the two of us looking out. And when I play a piano, it's like the two of us looking at each other. Like just the way of like interacting with an instrument. Because you can, with a guitar, you're sort of feeling your hands. You can sometimes stop and look, but really you learn and you move your hands around.
Right.
Whereas a piano, there's just something about like seeing it happen that changes something in my brain a little bit.
Yeah, and something more definitive with a piano. Like a guitar, you can kind of like fumble around.
Or you can always slide up if you got it a little wrong.
Exactly. You can even slide into the correct note. But a piano, you hit the wrong note. Everyone knows you're hitting the wrong note, unless you're doing like freeform jazz or something, right? So
Right. So true.
Yeah, but it is interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I'll switch. I'll like go back to guitar, and for the next record, I don't know what instrument I'll use. Maybe the cantala, that crazy Finnish instrument I have, which is wild. So also, you're a broadcaster in addition to these other things we talked about. So you've been working for Element FM here in Toronto for the past number of years now.
We launched 3 years ago.
3 years ago. Has it been that long? Holy cow, time flies.
Time flies.
Like, how did you get involved in that? Was that always like a dream? I always wanted to, hello, be on the radio.
Use my radio voice. Good afternoon, everyone. I've always loved radio. And I have done over the years, done a bit of radio work. I'd done like, when there was Out Front at CBC, I did an Out Front doc, and I had, through being interviewed all the time, because of my music, had kind of fallen into doing a bit of like storytelling on radio where I sort of, tell a 5-minute story. And I do really love it. I think I just like talking into microphones.
That's like, right. That's why I have the show. The only reason.
Just give me a microphone. And I kind of landed in that job. I'd actually first worked at AMI, which is Accessible Media. They're also based here in Toronto. Andy Frank, who used to be big in the folk scene.
Right?
Okay,
yes.
He was Roots Music Canada. And
love Andy.
Andy.
Yeah.
Legend. He'd moved on to AMI, and he was looking for co-hosts for their morning show. And he'd interviewed me once on Roots Music Canada, and he was like, you know what? I really liked interviewing you. I wonder if you'd like being the one doing the interviewing. And I was like, yeah, I want to try that. And so it's kind of thanks to him that I got a bit of experience. And then Element FM, I think because they're Indigenous owned, 25-30% of the artists on air are Indigenous. Their priority was to have Indigenous, DJs.
Sure.
And so I think that worked in my favor, that they were looking for for people, from the community to be on air. But I've learned a lot there. I mean, it's talking in 30 seconds, 45 seconds, trying to dial my short delivery and be peppy.
Right, peppy.
Yeah, I mean, it's mainstream. I mean, it's. I love that Indigenous artists are mixed in with these like top 40 artists, as they should be, because it's like the format is this. We play pop and hip hop and so I get to say, that was Taylor Swift and Nimkish. Like, I get to put these artists in the same breath, which is where they belong. But it is top 40 mainstream media, so I'm doing a lot of just sort of like pop culture, and it's energetic. I'm not sort of like so different from what I do in my own music or my, talking about grief for hours. I'm just talking about Justin Bieber or something. So it's fun. It's like a challenge to write bits that are gonna be, a whole little bit of content in 20 seconds or what have you.
And is that something you practice like the night before? You're in the mirror kind of psyching yourself up, practicing your 30-second lines? Or
this is my, there's two ways I've learned that people do it. Some people, on the fly can totally dial and deliver that bit. I always have even almost scripted bits. Like, I write everything and then read it sort of verbatim. I might start to sort of riff or throw some things in so it doesn't sound like I'm reading a script. So the skill has been more learning how to read things and make it sound like it's off the top of my head.
I see. Okay.
Because I cannot be trusted to deliver something in 20 seconds and remember what I'm doing, remember the best way to get out of it. Like, there's always sort of, on radio, you'll hear that kind of, not a punchline, right? But it's sort of like you have to leave them with a good like solid
a stinger
kicker.
Or something.
Yes.
Right.
And so that I can't always deliver that, improv. So, I have notes or I script it. And if I'm just doing like over an intro, like, hey, Toronto, it's 4:35, 6 degrees outside. I don't write that down, but I just find having the notes keep me on track.
That's good.
Otherwise it would be like 4 minutes and,
So you didn't like look up a bunch of things DJs say like on Google, like little one-liners or hire a joke writer to come up with those things?
But I should. I will now.
Great. And originally, like you were saying, you were from Vancouver and you moved to Toronto. How many years ago was that?
7 years ago.
That's 7 years ago. Okay, wow.
Yeah.
And how was it living out in the West Coast? Was it a big sort of you had to change everything and adapt now to living in Ontario with our harsh winters and all that sort of stuff?
It was a big culture shift. I mean, I grew up in Edmonton, and so the winter part was somewhere in my memory.
I see. Okay. Well, we're from Thunder Bay originally too, so
okay,
it's like,
so
yeah.
I also as being Cree and Scandinavian, I feel like it's the Toronto summers that do me. I'm like, this humidity. I'm not made for this humidity.
Yes.
The cold, I know. But I moved to Vancouver after high school. I was in Vancouver for 17 years. My, that first half of my adult life, and the culture shift coming to Ontario was like, or not even just Ontario, Toronto. It's very busy here. People are very busy.
Yes, very busy.
But sort of reliable in a way. Like, I feel like Vancouver is, it's West Coast. It's got that, like, it's more laid back.
Unreliable people is what you're saying. You hear that, Vancouver?
You hear that, Vancouver? No shade. It's sort of like you can be more spontaneous in Vancouver. I feel like in Vancouver, if I were like, hey, Mark, let's get a coffee tomorrow, you'd be like, sure, let's see. And then it might happen.
Right.
Or I'd be like, let's go right now. You'd be like, great, let's do it right now. I can do that. But I find in Toronto, I'm like, hey, let's go for coffee. You'd be like, okay, you get out your phone. You're like, I can do coffee on March 16th at 2:20, but just for 45 minutes. I'd be like, all right. But then on March 16th, you'd be there. Like,
that's right.
Like,
exactly.
we'd have that coffee.
That's right.
So I feel like things are sort of really structured and busy here. So you can't always be spontaneous.
Right.
People don't just stop by your house the way that I used to just stop by. Like, here people are like, what are you doing at my house? This is not in my calendar. Whereas Vancouver, there's like more of that ease.
Right.
But what that comes with here is like this vibrancy, and I sort of like the intensity here.
Certain energy.
A certain energy with it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what do you think? You came from Thunder Bay.
Yeah, no, there's definitely, and that's why, because there is a certain energy here, and there is a certain let's get things done. Versus whether you're in Thunder Bay or even Vancouver, it's hard to get things done. I think I was in Vancouver years ago, and I was just trying to get like photocopies done. And they're like, yeah, do you want to come back tomorrow? I'm like, why are you guys busy? Oh, no, we're, I forget what they were doing. They were doing something else. Like they had no customers. But here in Toronto, I was like, oh, yeah, well, if they have the time, they'll do it right there. Give you your copies before you can even finish your sentence, right?
Yeah.
Or they'll schedule a time that you'll come, Tuesday at 2:30, pick up your photocopies or whatever it is that you're getting done. Who gets
Right.
photocopies done now? It must have
Good
been for
example,
like a grant
though.
application or something.
Right. Remember when we used to have 6 copies? You have to
Oh,
deliver
my
6 copies to the
goodness.
OAC.
That's
yeah,
right.
Thank goodness that's over.
And you'd go to the copy store, and there'd be a ton of other artists doing the exact same
Because
thing.
they had to drop it off by noon. Yeah.
That's right. And now that's all. It's been a while since I've applied, but now that's all been. It's all online.
Yeah,
from
it's all
what
online.
I understand. Okay.
So now you deal with a spinning wheel of come on. But it's a little easier than the lineup at the copy place.
Okay. It's interesting. You're Cree and Scandinavian.
Yes.
Which Scandinavian country?
Swedish and Norwegian.
Okay, great. Have you ever been to any of those countries? Oh,
I feel like I'm also, I mean, from my indigenous side, French, which is where my last name comes from.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like a friend of mine recently was like, you never talk about your French heritage. And I was like, well, I mean, I have French heritage, but I have zero connection to the culture. It would be weird for me to call myself French Canadian. I can't do that.
Right.
Because I've not grown up with that culture or the language or no one around me, Whereas I feel like, of course, being Cree and with my father, it was very present. And my mom is the half Norwegian, half Swedish one. And, and so it was present. Like my grandmother and her sisters, all talked about, they grew up in New Norway, Alberta.
Okay.
But, there was sort of a presence of the jokes or the humor. And so I identify as Scandinavian because of that.
Okay.
But I have never been. I'd like to go.
Well, we were in Finland actually a couple of years ago because I'm half Finnish.
Yeah.
And in Thunder Bay actually has the highest Finnish population outside of Finland.
Right.
So we were actually in Finland. Love going there. It was unfortunately the end of October, so it was a little bit cold, but still wonderful place, wonderful country, wonderful people. Very highly educated people. They seem to have solved a lot of their social issues like homelessness, and of course they have free education.
Right, and they have long parental leave and
exactly.
stuff. Yeah.
Really great place, and everything was so efficient there. You would ask a question, and they would give you an answer that left no other questions because that's how informed they were, or they wanted you to have that information as well. So. It was a wonderful country. I ate way too much reindeer. I think ate all of reindeer. Santa's reindeer for the sled, but it was delicious.
Worth it.
Yeah, absolutely worth it. Getting back to music and then traveling. You've also traveled in Europe. You've done shows there as well.
Yeah, I sort of with my, I don't know which album, the 2012 album, Living Record, I toured so hard as much as I possibly could and started to do a mostly circuit around Germany. That was at the time they were really into kind of Americana singer-songwriters.
Right.
And a little bit in the Netherlands. And I went to the UK a couple times. It wasn't sort of as successful. I mean, this stuff takes time, as you know.
Right.
But I felt like in Germany, I just kind of landed into an audience there. And I briefly, actually, when I was thinking moving to Toronto, I was maybe going to move to Berlin and just be a touring folk singer in Germany.
Okay.
Did not do that. But I mean, one thing that I loved about touring in Germany versus touring Canada, I mean, I've also done the back and forth across Canada many times. Because it's so enormous here, you spend your whole day getting to the next gig,
That's
right?
That's right.
it. And you get to see it out the window, which is cool. But I found in Germany, the longest drive I'd ever have was maybe 3 hours.
Oh, great.
And so, you didn't have to set an alarm in the morning. You could go look around the town you were in. Or get to the next town and be a bit touristy or something before you still have to load in at 4. And so it felt really humane. Even one leg of, I did 3 weeks where I just was stationed in Bremen in the north, and I just stayed in one apartment in Bremen, and I'd go to the gig and then just drive home every night, because maybe at the most hour and a half or 2 hours, but getting to sleep in the same bed.
Right.
I was like, this is the dream. I'm touring and playing shows, but I'm not sleeping on some person's couch.
Right.
I loved it. I loved it.
Excellent. And how are the audiences different from Europe versus Canada, or are they different?
They were at the time. Again, I wonder how things have changed. I know everything changes so fast. What I noticed in Germany, again, sort of early, mid 2010s, in the teens a bit, they really, really clamped down on copyright, like digital copyright and any kind of pirating. So even like here, if you want to hear something, you might just like go to YouTube, right?
Sure.
And everything is there. We could just watch everything on YouTube.
Absolutely.
You know, I could go hear probably every song you've written on YouTube. It's
That's
just
right.
there.
Yeah.
And whereas in Germany, you can't look up anything on YouTube. It's just like, this is copyrighted, this is copyrighted. And so
really?
pirating never took off in the same way as it did in North America because they really shut it down,
Right.
which means that like digital intake and content hadn't taken off in the same way again
I
at the
see.
time. But so I was like going to people's houses 2014 and they still had, you know, the like shelves of CDs proudly in their living room, and that's how
Okay.
we listened to music.
Right.
Because no one was pirating. They also weren't really doing like iTunes or Spotify because they just weren't accessing music digitally in the same way.
Right. Okay.
But it also meant they all bought music a lot. Like they
That's awesome.
yeah, I think even if we're paying for our Spotify subscription, we're just like, we think music is free. I'm saying we, not you and me.
Yeah.
But like, I feel
It's not,
like,
by the way.
no, it's not. It's actually really expensive. But we have this sort of mentality that we can hear unlimited music for $10 a month, whereas that shift hadn't really been happening about how they value music. And so I found people were very happy to pay for a show, to pay for a CD. And they were so attentive, and they would just, just sit there so quietly and listen. And just like, it was great. And it was fun because I think with music, or at least with my writing, I've always kind of, I've thought a lot of times that it's my lyrics that's getting them. In North America, like, the sort of play on words or like a pop culture reference in my lyrics, I'm like, that's going to get them. That's going to get their attention. And in Germany, where, a lot of people speak English, many are totally fluent, but not always. And they weren't getting the same jokes or whatever. But it kind of freed me up to then, I was like, oh, then they're just listening to my voice, or they're just listening to the melody. And it was sort of a lovely shift as a performer, because I'm always so like, I've always been so focused on delivering my lyrics and the story and even my banter. I'm like, here's the story that goes with the song.
Right.
And there I'd tell the story, and I just sort of get these, people gazing at me because they couldn't quite understand what I said. And I was like, okay, I got to do something else. And so
Right.
I started to like play more with my vocals and kind of switch up some of my like delivery a little bit, because I just was like, might as well see how this works, see how this lands. And so it was great. I found, people were so attentive. They really valued music in a way that I think we've lost here a bit. Like, again, like monetarily, but also the time that it takes a musician to show up and do a thing. It's like they're more aware of what goes into that. And then, this sort of freedom to like play with my sound a little.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Could they be more aware of it because they don't have pirating and access to like tons of music that now, if you look at it, in fact, you could say the market is sort of oversaturated with new releases. I forget what the number is in Canada. I read somewhere, this was years ago, it was like 40,000 records come out a year. So, so if you're a programmer or a artistic director, it's really hard to decide who you're going to put in that slot when you only have 5 slots, but yet you got 500 submissions that week.
Yeah.
And also venues keep closing here, especially in Toronto and just in Canada in general, from what I've been reading. I'm not sure what the landscape is like in Europe.
I don't know. Again, maybe it's changed in the last few years. So
Right.
we'd have to ask someone who's gone, before COVID.
Before COVID, that's right.
2019. Someone who toured in 2019.
Exactly.
But I feel like even when I lived in the UK for a year in my 20s, there was just like a way. I remember I was traveling with a friend who's a dancer, and we're going through customs, and she finally, like, going into customs in Canada, she's like, I'm a dancer, and people are like, okay, no, but what's your job? And she's like, well, I'm a dancer, and people are like, no, but what do you do for a living? Whereas going into Europe, she'll be like, I'm a dancer, and people are like, oh, like ballet, modern, there's no question of like, well, that's not a job.
That's right.
And so where does that start? Like, does it start with the funding for the arts? Does it start with our participation in the arts? I don't know where those things start to get devalued, because there's all these different aspects of it. One, not taking it seriously, one, not paying for it.
We'll have a sort of different cultural attitude in Europe towards the arts in general.
Yeah, it's just sort of, it's seen accurately as an equal, sort of career and as a contribution to the world around you. It's not,
and not just a hobby.
It's not a hobby or
something you're just doing for fun.
Yeah, pipe dream.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People are weird over here in North America when it comes to the arts, I've noticed, and I'm sure there's tons of studies done on why and possible sort of remedies for that. But at the end of the day, I still don't know. What the answer is. And I've been trying to figure that out for years. So with that said, we're coming up. We have maybe another 5 minutes left on the show. So what sort of advice do you have then, I guess, for musicians that are just starting out? Because when we started, it was a different musical landscape. We still had CDs. And even when I started, there was no internet. So to kind of research venues, I'd have to go to like the library and look in like something called a phone book. So this was all pre-internet. But now everyone has kind of like technology, tools to access, social media.
Yeah.
So do you think it's harder or easier now for musicians?
Both.
And what sort of advice would you have
this is, the way we can shape a story. Because we could say either side of that coin and both would be true stories. I sometimes think about us as musicians as like miners in a mining town, and the mine has closed, but none of us are leaving the town.
Oh yeah, that's a good analogy. That's great. Yeah,
and everyone is like, "What are you still doing there?
Right.
There is no work for you."
Right.
Because of these just, revenue streams that are gone, the way that touring is, not the same necessarily. And then the loss of CD sales is huge, and not making the same income from streaming. Like that's just a major income loss for a lot of us, right?
Absolutely.
Especially considering the investment in making music. So the great Canadian musician's dream of breaking even, much less like paying your rent, is like even harder. I think in many ways it's even harder. At the same time, that sort of democratization and that accessibility of being able to Google venues, look at someone else's tour dates and contact those places, reasonably, build some skills and make your album yourself, do a great social media campaign that's better than, what a publicist might have gotten for you. Although I always hire a publicist, would be my advice.
Excellent.
So, I think both things are true. I think it's hard. It's a really hard industry, and that breaks my heart. At the same time, what I used to always say, and I think is still true, there is room for everyone. You say $40,000 a year, but at the same time, make it $40,001. Like your music, your album is valuable. What you have to say and make is important. I believe that so deeply that I can't quite say leave the mining town. I'm like, but hold on. Because I think we always need more art, right? But as a career and as an industry, it's tricky.
Right, absolutely. And any advice for aspiring writers that have an idea for a book and want to get it out there, or maybe even try to get it to a publisher? What advice do you have for them?
I think similarly, we all need to hear your story. And it is, a different kind of work. Like I said, the thing about don't write a book unless you absolutely have to. But if you have that fire and that drive to do it, then you should do it. When it comes to memoir, the really helpful tool for me was something called the Memoir Project by Marion Roach Smith. And she talks about the vomit draft. And I think that's some of the best advice. Like just sit down and get out some kind of version. Blah, just do it.
Okay.
Because then you have something to work with. Then you can edit, then you can reshape. But the hardest part is like getting those words on the page, and then you have something to mold and shape. Sticking with it and just getting it out.
The first step is always the hardest, they say, in getting something done.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
My pleasure.
It was great to talk to you again and see you again in person. And how can people find you online and support your music?
Right. Well, my music, Bandcamp, Spotify, Apple Music. And on Bandcamp, you can get CDs and vinyl and cassettes even.
Cassettes?
I have cassettes of my last EP. I seriously do. There's like cassette nerds out there. So if you're listening, cassette nerds, get my cassette. In all the digital places, all the streaming places, ChristCouture.com. And then Instagram is kind of my go-to most beloved social media.
And
so
I saw
that's-
your picture today on Instagram. You're on a comic.
Yes, there's a new comic anthology out that features a story that I wrote. And the artist made the cover for the book. That's this drawing of me on a comic book.
Well, that's your next foray, graphic novels.
There you go.
Excellent. Well, thank you again so much for being on the show, and thank you again for watching.